Well, today I finish up this series on love that I've been in the midst of, and as I've shared in my humble opinion, there is no more important topic for us to be looking at as followers of Christ. It's my prayer that these 3 weeks are going to cause us to talk a lot. It's my prayer that this series is going to offer a glimpse of what I believe this chapel is called to be about ultimately at its core. And hopefully this series is going to serve as a nudge for each of us to take an honest look at ourselves and where we really are with loving God, loving people, and loving ourselves. As I've been saying, love is the bottom line in the whole deal. And we learn this from a variety of places. First and foremost, we learn this from Scripture. A fellow named John followed Jesus, and Jesus taught John that God is love, that love comes from God, and that when our focus is on loving God and people through action, that our lives are in alignment with God and the ultimate purpose of life. Jesus lived these truths, and John wrote it down. But we can also garner the truth that love is at the bottom line by looking at the lives and actions of people. Bad things happen, don't they, when love is distorted or absent or mislabeled or used for power and manipulation. In my opinion, love issues are at the core of what ails this planet. The lives of people within the planet. And love issues have been the root cause for every misguided decision and action of every church. But the converse is also true. Love is at the epicenter when human beings get it right. All that is good, all that is right, all that is true comes from love. And people for centuries have experienced this firsthand. People for centuries have known that love changes everything, including perspectives, values, priorities, physical and psychological health, how challenges are faced in relationships. Name it, love affects it. Yet with all this said, love is not easy to grasp or understand in its totality. And I shared last week that the Greek language is helpful to look at some of the nuances in love, nuances of love. And I shared that there are at least 4 major kinds of love as described in Greek. Some of those nuances reflected in our readings today. There's Eros, or passionate, romantic, sexual love. There is Storge, or a binding love that comes from familiarity and knowing another person well. There's Philia love, which is brotherly or platonic love. And finally, Agape, the penultimate expression of love. Love that is unconditional, a no matter what love, a love without bounds. Selfless, self-sacrificing love that puts the needs of other people first. And when John followed Jesus and when he wrote down what he learned from Jesus, what he wrote is, God is love, God is agape. And it is this kind of love that comes from God, and human beings can only begin to love this way through the love of God. It's only possible with God to love in this way. And when Jesus told his followers that the entire scriptures, all of it, the whole thing, the whole story, when he said the whole thing is fulfilled when you love God and love others, he was speaking about agape. Well, this morning I want to wrap up touching on 2 things. How do we make our lives more focused on loving God and loving others and ourselves? And some very brief comments on how the chapel might go about becoming a place that increasingly focuses on love itself more than anything else. And when I say love, I'm using the word agape. So let's explore love when it comes to our own lives. And to get us started, I'd like to point out first is some things that can actually hinder or get in the way of love. Not only the love that we have for others and for God, but in fact for ourselves. And one thing that hinders love has to do with materialism. The kind of materialism that runs rampant in our culture and certainly in this valley. Now, one good definition of materialism is a preoccupation with or an emphasis on material objects, comforts, and considerations. Now, the key word here in this definition, in my opinion, is not the word material, but the word emphasis. You see, material things, including money, in and of themselves, are just things. But such things become an issue when material things become our point of emphasis in life. Jesus one day said to a person, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, when Jesus used the word heart, he was conveying what the word heart meant in his day. He wasn't talking about an organ. What Jesus meant was the heart is the place from within us that feels and thinks and decides how to act. The heart was basically who we are as people. And Jesus was trying to say that what we value the most determines what we think, feel, and do. So if our treasure or our emphasis, our focus is on material goods, not only will our thinking and feelings be in service of things, but so will our actions. Our lives become about things, not people, as a result. And implicit in Jesus' teaching is that we all have the capacity to choose what we treasure. And when we choose to emphasize things, we end up de-emphasizing love. But just as an emphasis on stuff hinders love, so can a focus on status, prestige, position, or stature. Remember, agape is selflessness, sacrifice, putting the needs of the other ahead of our own. Status, prestige, and the like are not about other, but are about self. Hence the distinct opposite of what agape is all about. Self-serving self-promotion entails other demotion. This is why Paul wrote, "Practice playing second fiddle in life." There's a story about Jesus' close followers. You know it well. It's near the end of the Last Supper. And what do the apostles do? They bicker about who's the greatest. Jesus is about to be crucified, and they're fighting over who is the greatest. And Jesus says, "Time out. Kings like to throw their weight around. And people in authority like to give themselves fancy titles. Stop it. You're here to love." And something else that can hinder love has to do with focusing or putting an emphasis in our lives on cultural expectations instead of God's. Now, cultural expectations are as varied as cultures themselves. And while some cultural expectations may be in alignment with God, like freedom, many are not. That's why Paul one day wrote, "Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without ever thinking about it. Instead, fix your attention on God, and you will be changed from the inside out. And as a result, you will love from the inside out, because you will be focusing on God, who is love." So prioritizing materialism, status, prestige, along with grounding ourselves in cultural mores rather than God, can hinder our ability to engage agape. But perhaps more important than looking at hindrances to love, of which there are far more than I can get into, perhaps it's more important to look at some things we can proactively do to make our lives more open to the love of God and to act on that love. So I'd like to skim across just a few ideas. Well, this is perhaps very obvious. But if we want our lives to be about loving God and loving people, we need to name it. We need to claim it. We need to prioritize it. We need to continually reaffirm that. I can't tell you how many mornings in my life I've gotten out of bed and faced the world reacting to what came my way. How many days I got out of bed and I spent energy responding to what came my way. rather than determining from the get-go what I was going to make the day about. So here's a powerful experiment. I think it's a game changer. Pick a day, any day. And when you wake up, say to yourself with vigor, passion, conviction, and intention, today is about love. I'm going to love God, and I'm going to love every person I encounter through action. This doesn't mean you don't work. It means when you work, you're going to be intentional about loving the people you work with. This doesn't mean you don't play. It means you're going to love people intentionally while you're playing. This doesn't mean you don't go about your chores. It means you love people while you're going about your chores. This doesn't mean you don't allow people to serve you in a restaurant. It means you go about loving the people who are serving you in the restaurant. And there's so many ways to love. Affirmation, listening, gratitude, encouragement, acknowledgement. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And what's interesting to me is that loving a person often takes no more time than not loving. So I invite you to do this. Some day this week, wake up, your eyes pop open, say, today's about love. I'm going to love people and I'm going to love God by what I do. And I'm going to push through any obstacle that gets in the way of it. And the more we start each day with such a purpose, and there is no more important purpose, it's why, again, I believe we have life to begin with. And when we're intentional about loving God, we're going to discover that we've finally gotten to the core of what life is all about. I know that, for example, on my deathbed, I pray that the one thing I will be able to say is not that I thought right, I believed right, I achieved this or I achieved that. My fervent prayer is that I love the way God wanted me to love in my life. Nothing else will matter. Related to this is to keep in mind that agape is less about a feeling and far more about doing. That's why there's this great little book with the title, Love Does. In other words, love is about what we do. It's not so much about what we feel. And when we keep the notion that love is more of a verb than a noun front and center, it helps us to love even when we don't feel the emotion of love. This is so critical in our relationships and our marriages to remember that. Feelings come and go. Actions can be consistent. When we remember that love is a verb more than a noun, it helps us experience the truth that love comes from doing, not so much that doing comes from love. Love is about serving. And when we act in and for love, love wells up within us. Healing. If we want our lives to be about loving God and loving people and loving ourselves, we've got to take our own healing seriously. There's nobody here today, I dare say, who is immune from heartache, pain, and disappointment. Every single human being has stuff to work through. I've got lots of stuff to work through. I've got deep places of brokenness. And God, I believe, wants each of us to heal and to work through our places of brokenness to eventually arrive at a place where we are at peace with ourselves. It's extraordinary, but our own journeys with pain, if we take that journey seriously, our own journeys at healing, if we take that healing seriously, ends up being the place from which we experience deep empathy, compassion, understanding, and love towards other people. It's when we learn to work through our own wounds that we position ourselves to walk with others alongside of them as they work through their own wounds. This is why it's so important we not run from our stuff, but with the help of God and others, turn into our stuff and seek healing. And part of healing is allowing God's love to saturate our lives. And when we accept God's love, when we move toward loving ourselves and it infuses us, we begin to love more because we know how much we are loved. So work on wounds. get help working on wounds. You will love more. And while there's so much more, the final thing I'm going to touch on that has to do with love with regard to ourselves and relationships has to do with the hardest challenge of all. And that is learning to let go. I think one of the most profound things that Jesus ever said is, when you lose your life for me, you will find it. That's letting go. Jesus was saying, turn your life over to me. When you're Jesus-centered, you're not self-centered. When you're willing to relinquish the control of your lives to God, you will discover and get in touch with who we really are and why we're here, which is love. This is all about going through the rigorous, tough, hard work of saying to God, here I am, I'm yours. All that I am, all that I have, it's all yours. Make me your servant. Use me in any way you want to. I'll follow. I'll go. Make my life about love, God. Please help me with this. And for God's sakes, God, help me to let go. And God is love. And so when we let go and turn our lives to God, we're turning our lives over to love. Now, I need to be clear that making our lives about love is not about perfection or having it all down or having the right pedigree or the right degree or the right vocational success or knowledge of every chapter and verse or being religious enough or meeting certain standards. Love has nothing to do with any of that stuff. It has everything and only to do with letting go. Whatever we've done, wherever we are, whoever we are, turning our lives to God. And what is so strikingly poignant to me about all of this is that for us to get that love is about letting go, God had to let go too. He let go of his beloved son, Jesus. He let go of his son so that Jesus could go to a place in which control, power, and self was far more important to many than love. So I want to finish up this series now with just some very brief thoughts about making the chapel more and more about agape and love. I'm going to be getting into this a lot in the future. I think that part of what we need to do here at the chapel is to reframe how we see ourselves and to reframe how we see our roles in the life of the chapel. You see, ultimately, I believe the chapel is not a destination, but rather it's an outpost in a frontier filled with broken lives, pain, confusion, addiction, messed up values and priorities, and heartache. This chapel is an outpost in a frontier where things exist that are tough in abundant numbers across every economic category. You see, I believe we are called to be frontiersmen and frontierswomen for Jesus. The outpost, the chapel, is where we gather to get refueled and encouraged and equipped and supported by one another to go out back into the frontier in love. Every single one of you is called to go out in love. The outpost, the chapel, is where we focus on Jesus, the one who sends us out to love in his name. We are surrounded by so many people who need to encounter the love of God more than anything else. I see it every single day. We need to be a place where outreach isn't a program, is not a program, but one in which reaching out is who we are. And I think if we begin to view the chapel as an outpost, it's going to compel us to ask some questions. How do we all become servants? How do we love people through action right around us? How do we transform Snowmass Village and the Upper Valley in all the brokenness and lostness despite its outward glitz and glory? How do we transform it with love? And are we spending too much time and money on ourselves instead of the people that aren't here? This fall, the staff and I and governing boards read a book by Jen Hatfield titled Interrupted: When Jesus Wrecks Your Comfortable Christianity. She's got a voice I'm paying attention to because I think it's God's voice. Here's some excerpts of what she writes that made me feel uncomfortable. She writes, in most churches, the ministries, programs, volunteers, and nearly all the human and financial resources serve weekend attendees. But what about those too frozen in suffering to come to church? What about people who despise church and despise Christians and can't figure out what on earth this good news is supposed to be about? What about the spiritually hungry? And what if we need to go to them instead of hoping they'll just start coming to us? What we need to do is dig up, recover, and find again Jesus' community, the kind of church that Jesus died for. Jesus continually colored outside of the lines, and so must we as his followers. We've got to go to our neighborhoods, our schools, our gyms, our community, and love people where they are. And finally, she writes, which is very powerful, love wins more converts than theology. And people were first drawn to Jesus' mercy and love long before they understood his divinity. As I said, there's a lot here, and I'm going to be getting into this over the months ahead with all of us, how we become an outpost, not a church, not a building, but a place that sends people out to love. Well, I've covered a ton of ground in the last 3 weeks, far too much to remember for sure. But I hope that you're going to take some time and reflect and ponder and talk about some of what we've covered. Talk about with friends, talk about with other people here at the chapel. But through it all, I hope that there will be one thing that you will think about more than all. And that is, it has to do with my hope and prayer. And my hope and prayer is that God is going to instill within each one of you and within me just one thing. More than anything else. Just one thing. This is what I'm praying for all of you and for me and for this chapel, that God will give us just one thing: a passion to love. It's the whole deal. I believe it's what our lives are about. And after all, as we heard earlier, love is the only house big enough for all the pain in the world.